and welcome back to BHookedCrochet.com. In today's tutorial, we are going to discuss how to create the hairpin lace infinity scarf. This is a free pattern that's available up on my blog, and you can find the link to that post in the description below. To complete your own hairpin lace infinity scarf, you are going to need a hairpin lace loom, a size 5 or H crochet hook, 3 skeins of Red Heart Boutique's Treasure Line yarn in the colorway of your choice, and you also need a darning needle and a pair of scissors. To begin creating our scarves, we need to first set up our hairpin lace loom. Now, if you've purchased one at a craft store, yours should look something like this. Basically, we've got 2 removable portions at the top and the bottom. And first of all, you want to make sure that your loom is set up to the widest setting. So if you look at this, you should have different circles in order for you to place these bars, so you can make your strips different sizes. So we want to make this at the largest setting. So we've got it fully secure on the bottom, and then up at the top we want it secured on one side and we want it open on the other. Once you have your hairpin lace loom set up like that, go ahead and grab your yarn, and we're going to create a slip knot. Just a regular slip knot, just as if you were crocheting. Now, once we have our slip knot created, instead of making it smaller like we normally would to place on our hook, we actually want to make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so just make yourself a nice big slip knot. From here, grab your hairpin lace loom, and you want to have the yarn coming from the back side of the loom. And then we're simply just going to place our slip knot over the bar, just like that. Now, once we have our slip knot on the bar, we can close up our loom. And this is going to keep all of our strands from coming off as we're working. Now your loom should look something like this. One thing that is very important when starting out in the hairpin lace loom, you want to make sure that your slip knot is roughly in the center of the 2 bars. And that's because when we crochet up the hairpin lace loom, we want our stitches to be roughly in the center, because as we create the loops on the side, we want the loops to be the same length on one side as they are the other, and that's going to make our scarf a little bit more uniform and look more professional when we're finished. Starting the first couple of stitches when working with hairpin lace is probably the most difficult out of the entire process. Just keep in mind that if you've never worked with hairpin lace before, it's going to be quite different, and you do have to get used to learning how to handle the loom and just how to hold everything in your hands. We'll try to go as slow as possible, and we'll try to get some different camera angles so you can see exactly where I'm working and exactly how I'm turning the loom. We want to hold the loom in our hand just like this. And as I said before, we want to make sure that our yarn is coming from the back side. And that's very important. If the yarn is in front of the loom, it's not going to work out for you, okay? So make sure that you've got it coming from the back. Now, basically all we need to do, we want to keep some tension on the yarn here, but we don't want to pull too tight. Depending on the type of slip knot that you made, if I pull this strand, I'm going to be moving my slip knot over. Okay, and that's not what we want. Like I said, we want to have our slip knot as close to the center of the loom as possible. So with that in mind, I like to collect my yarn up in my hand just as if I were crocheting regularly. And I just kind of hold the strand to this bar on this side just to kind of steady things, but it helps me not to pull the yarn and pull the slip knot over to the other side. And essentially all we want to do, now we want to let the yarn flow through our hand a little bit as we do this, but we're just going to flip the loom over to the other side. And now again, I'm just being real careful right now to make sure my slip knot doesn't move. And from here you can see that I've got this strand right here is the working yarn, and that's coming from the back side of the loom. And then over on this side, I have my slip knot. So I've got essentially 2 strands of yarn right there. And then right here, I have just a single strand. Now, basically what we need to do to start out is generally starting out in crochet, you know, it's the same type of idea. We have to chain 1 in order to start working in single crochets. You know, that's how we do things when we crochet regularly. So we're going to do that now. We are going to place our hook into the slip knot. Now I've just got my hook under one of those loops, and I'm going to hook the working yarn, and I'm just going to pull the working yarn through that slip knot, just like that. Now we will get another angle on this, so just bear with me if you don't have the proper angle. Now what we need to do from here is create our chain. So we're going to grab the working yarn again, yarn over, just like we would if we were creating a regular chain. Now sometimes you may have to steady this a little bit with your hands, and that's perfectly fine, but you want to pull that yarn over through the loop that was on your hook. And essentially we've done 2 things by creating this chain. We've started our foundation, and we have secured the yarn to the loom, and we have secured the slip knot in place. So now we don't have to worry about the slip knot moving around so much. Once we have our chain secured in place, it's time for us to start working our first stitch. And in order to do that, we have to make our hook come from the other direction, so that way we can flip the loom over. So we always have our hook in the front of the loom, but in order to create all of the strands in the wraps, we have to basically flip the loom every single time we're ready to create a stitch. And what we do to get the hook coming from the other direction is simply take our hook, and we want to put it through the top portion of the loom, basically bottom side first, and then turn it upright again. Now don't worry, we'll go through that again in case you didn't catch it. Once we have our hook coming from the back side, we need to flip the loom. And as we do it, we want to make sure we let the working yarn kind of flow through our fingers. And that's all there is to it. So what we've done here is create a second wrap over on this side. And we've got our hook in position so we can just start going. Now, if you remember, when we first started out, we had to put the hook through the slip knot. And that's true throughout the entire course of crocheting this strip that we're working on. But if you look at what we have available, it's not the slip knot anymore, but it's the previous stitch. And this looks exactly the same as the slip knot. There are basically two loops. And we want to put our hook under just one of the loops. Okay, so essentially we are going to crochet right over top of this strand of yarn right here. Once we have our hook inserted, we're going to yarn over. So we're going to grab the working yarn and pull up a loop, just like that. And then we are going to yarn over and pull through two. Now that is just your standard single crochet, nothing fancy. Now we're ready to begin the second stitch, and we need to set up our hook the same way that we did before. We need to put our hook towards the back side of the loom, and then we need to flip the loom over. So we'll go through this one more time. Take the hook, turn it around and through and back down. Okay, and now we flip the loom and we're ready to go with our next stitch. Now at this point I'm gonna get a closer camera angle so you can see exactly where it is that I'm working these stitches. Starting off with our next stitch, if we look at what we have here, we've got 2 loops that we've worked already, and we want to put our hook under the top loop only, okay? We're not catching this one down here, we're only working on this one, and we're just putting our hook under the first strand, so the strand that's closest to us. Once we have our hook under that loop, we're going to grab our working yarn and we're going to pull it through that strand. Okay, now we're set up for our single crochet, so we just need to yarn over and pull that loop through the 2 loops on your hook to single crochet. And we've completed that stitch. Now, once again, we need to get our hook in position for the next stitch. So we want to take our hook, turn it around and through and back down. Now we flip the loom and we're set up to go on to the next stitch. Just like before, we have 2 loops here. We're going to put our hook under just the loop that's closest to us. We're going to grab the working yarn and pull it through that loop. We're going to yarn over and pull through 2. Moving along, we're going to take our hook, turn it around and through and back down. Now flip the loom and we're ready to work. Now we have 3 loops over on this bar, and we're just going to have more and more loops as we go along. Place the hook into the loop, grab the working yarn and pull it through, yarn over and pull through 2. Take our hook, turn it around and through and back down. Turn the loom and single crochet over that first loop. That is essentially the basic hairpin lace stitch. And all we need to do at this point is continue along crocheting in this fashion until we have 230 loops on our hook. That's going to give us the length of one of the strips. Now let's talk a little bit about the pattern. What we need to create is a total of 4 hairpin lace strips, just like we're creating here, and we are going to attach all 4 of those together to create the scarf, and at that point it's going to be kind of like a regular scarf. It'll just be a long scarf, and then we're going to sew the 2 ends together in order to make it an infinity scarf. As you're working, you want to be aware of your tension a little bit. You don't want to make your wraps and your stitches so tight that the loops don't move around on your loom. But you do, however, need to have it tight enough so that you've got the stitch working straight across. You don't want it to be sagging or hanging down in any way. It may take a little bit of practice, but once you do probably 20 or so stitches, I'd say you probably would have the hang of it. And you don't have to worry so much about your tension. At this point, you should have a pretty good idea of how to create just the regular hairpin lace stitch. And if you're struggling in any way, just know that that's completely normal. It took me a little bit of practice to get down the motions of crocheting with this loom. It's a little bit awkward and you have to kind of get used to it. But if you're having difficulty figuring out where to work your stitches, or if you're having a little bit of trouble with starting out and keeping everything even, feel free to just go back through the video and watch it, you know, over and over until you get it right. You do want to make sure, like I said, that starting off your stitches are roughly in the center. And like I said, you want to do that because we need to have the strands that we're working with on each side roughly the same size. Now you'll notice it's, you know, it sometimes can take on a little bit of a curve, and that's basically just because of starting out. It was a little bit tighter here, and now I'm crocheting a little bit looser. And even though you can see the curve here, I'm really not too concerned with that. You're definitely not going to be able to tell once you get the scarf going, and it's actually pretty difficult to get the stitches exactly in the center of the loom and staying in the center pretty consistently. So if you've got a little bit of a curve like this going on, don't be too worried at all. I really wouldn't go as far as ripping it out and doing it over, because as I said, it's just super difficult to get this exactly perfect. Now that we've gotten the hang of the basic stitch, we just want to continue working this same stitch until we have 230 loops on our loom. Now, I would recommend using some type of stitch marker and counting as you go along. You can use a regular stitch marker that you would use for crocheting or knitting, or you can tie on little strands, you know, of spare yarn. Just tie it around the bar on, you know, one side or the other. And we do want to make sure that we have 230. Now, if you are off by, you know, 1 or 2, you know, maybe even 3, I wouldn't worry too much about it. When we join these together, we are going to be pulling groups of 5 in order to create that kind of braid that you saw in the picture. And if we have 1 or 2 left over, or if we have, you know, 4 loops at the end instead of 5, you're not going to be able to tell a whole lot. But the best way to avoid this problem is to keep track of your loops as you go along. Basically, all you need to do is decide what increment you want to count in. So here I've got 15 loops along this side, and now I'm just going to take a spare piece of yarn and I'm just simply going to tie it onto the bar. Nothing fancy, you don't even really have to do a big knot, just something to let you know that this group is 15 stitches. And once you get that tied on, just continue crocheting in the same way as before. Now we just want to pull our guide off to the side so we don't crochet around them, and crochet into our loop just like we did before, and just continue on working. Now we want to make sure that, you know, the new wrap goes over, you know, so it's in the right place. And that's really all there is to it. You can count in increments of 20 or 50, or, you know, if you don't want to mark off your loops, you really don't have to, okay? Just make your life a little bit easier in the long run. At some point, you may have to join on a new ball of yarn. Now, as you can see, the skein that I'm working with is about halfway. If you are using the treasure yarn like I recommend, you will be able to get one full strain or one full strip of hairpin lace loom with 230 loops, and that's actually what I've done here. So I've got about half of this skein left. Now you can't do exactly 2 strips with one skein. You actually end up only needing about 20 more loops or so when you get to the end. So at some point you're going to have to know how to join on a new ball of yarn. So what I'm going to do is continue crocheting my hairpin lace loom until I run out of yarn here. And when I do that, I'm going to come back and I'll show you how to join on your new skein of yarn. Alright, so I've come to the end of the skein that I was working on. I've got just a little piece left here. And what I need to do now is join on my new skein. And to do this, I've actually gotten quite lucky here. This color change yarn that I'm using, it ended basically on the same color that my new skein started. So that actually worked out quite well. If you're really particular and you want there to be a gradual change throughout your colorway like it does throughout the entire piece, you may have to search for a place on your new yarn ball that is going to be similar to the color as you ended up with here. To join on the new yarn, basically all we're going to do is tie a knot. Now we don't actually have the proper foundation in order to crochet the new piece in. So there may be other ways to do this. This is how I do it. Honestly, you don't see the knot once everything is said and done. So that's why I'm okay to do it this way. I feel like it's much easier than trying to crochet it into this little foundation row that goes up the middle. So basically all I'm doing here is just tying a knot, just a regular knot. And I want to make sure it's pretty tight, so we don't want it to come loose. And once we have the knot in there, I'm just going to cut off some of the tail there, some of the fuzzy pieces, so it doesn't stick out so much. So there will be a visible knot if you use this method, and as I said, the knot's not going to show up later. So once you have that in place, you can continue on crocheting just like we did before. So I ended up here, and so now I just need to scoop my stitches down and set up for my next stitch, and you'll see the knot start to work its way through here in about 1 or 2 stitches. Now at this point I have about 180 stitches on my loom, and I don't have that much left to work to finish this off. So as you can see, you've got your knot there, and this part looks like it's going to work right into the single crochet. So once you get that stitch in there, you can see it's concealed pretty well. What I'm going to do now at this point is finish crocheting the last few loops that I need to make my 230, and I need you to do the same. I need you to have 4 of these strips in order to create the scarf. But before you start on your next strip, I will show you a technique that is commonly used in hairpin lace, and it's optional. You don't absolutely have to do it. It does require a little extra work and some scrap yarn, but it makes things a lot easier and quicker when we go to join these together. And basically this technique is using what they call a guide, and The guide is basically your spare piece of yarn, and essentially all we'll do is weave that into each side, and that will keep our loops together, because when you remove these from the loom, the loops tend to go a little haywire. They'll twist up, and they can even tangle up, and that just makes things a lot more difficult when you actually go to join these. So finish yourself off until you've reached the last stitch, so the 230th stitch. Come back and I'll show you how to work the guide in through the piece, and there is also a recommended storage method that you can use until you finish crocheting all 4 of your strips, and that's just to keep things a little bit more organized. Now that we have all of our stitches worked on our hairpin lace loom, we're ready to bind off. And as I mentioned in the last clip, we are going to be adding on some guides in order to make things a little bit more organized and make our lives a lot easier when we go to join this. So the way I've left things is I have my loop here that I was just working my stitches through, and over on the back side is where my working yarn is coming from. Now, you don't really have to leave a very long tail for this, you know, just cut probably 6 inches or so, and that should do. And to finish binding off, you're going to do this the same way as you would in regular crochet. So I'm just going to use my hook here to help me, and the way I like to bind off is to just pull the tail through the loop that was on my hook, and that's going to fasten things off for you. Now that we've got our strip binded off and we're ready to basically finish this strip, I'm going to go through the instruction of using a guide to keep all of these little loops in order so they don't twist around and, you know, go all haywire while you're storing them until you're finished with all 4 of your strips. Basically what I've done off camera is just cut a really long piece of scrap yarn. Now, I don't really have an exact measurement for this. It's several feet long. I tend to keep it on the extra long side because you can cut it down as you need. Basically, when you take this off of the loom, as you can imagine, it's going to expand and become very long. So you don't want to just have a piece that's long enough for one side. You got to figure that this is probably going to be 3 times the size that it is when it's on the loom. To get this started, the easiest way that I have found to work your guide into every single loop, and it takes a little bit of time, but I typically just do it in little tiny sections at a time, you know, where I've got probably 10 or 15 loops, and I want to make sure that I've got each one of the loops, and I'll just put my finger under there, and I'll go ahead and stick my hook under all of the loops, and then I'm just going to take the end of my scrap yarn that I cut and just hook it just like that, and work it through underneath those stitches, and then you just want to pull yourself a little bit of slack. Now once you've got that section, I typically just hold on to it with my hand, grab myself another section of yarn, just working my finger under it, and then placing my hook under those stitches, and then grabbing the yarn, so this is the tail end again, and pull that straight on through those new loops there, and just continue to do that until you reach the bottom. Now, as I said before, this step is optional. You don't have to do this. If you think that it's more trouble than it's worth, then you just skip forward a little bit in the video. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to show you how to do this for those who decide to use the guides, but just know that you don't have to. Okay, once you've worked your guide completely through one side of your loom, you will want to pull your slack down at the bottom pretty far. Okay, so probably about half the length of the yarn that you cut for your guide. So once you get that positioned, then you'll just rotate the loom, and then you'll basically work from top to bottom just like we did before. Okay, so we're using the same end that we started with, and we're just going to basically lay this along the top side and then just start feeding it through the loops on the opposite side. Now, if you don't want to do it this way, but you still want to use guides, you can do two separate pieces and just, you know, cut the yarn long enough for one side, and then once you get finished with that one, then just run a separate piece of yarn up through the side. I find that, you know, this way works for me. I feel like it's not too bad. It's, you know, the first time you do it, it's a little bit time consuming, but you're making 4 of these, so you kind of get the hang of it by the time you get to the last strip that you're making. And as I said, you will find that this saves you a lot of time in the long run. Okay, so go ahead and finish working your guide down the second side of the loom, and then we'll work on taking this strip off of the loom, and I will show you the best way to store it until you're ready to join. I finished placing the guides on each side of my hairpin lace loom, and I've got the 2 ends coming out the bottom, and I like to start working at the top. So I'm going to pull my stitches down a little bit, and then I'm going to remove the bar that's up at the top. And if your loom is like mine, you got to put some muscle into this to get these off. So bear with me for just a second. There we go. Okay, remove your guides, and we're basically just going to slip it off just a little bit at a time. And the easiest way to keep this from tangling and twisting, because believe me, this strip that we crocheted wants to twist up and do its own thing. So we're just going to work some stitches off the loom and just roll it as we go along. And you can see by doing this and having the guides there, it's keeping all of our loops going the same direction, and they're all still in order, and that's exactly what we want. That's why I like spending the extra time to put the guides in. Alright, we're almost there. This colorway is really cool. I'm really liking this. Okay, once our loom is off of the yarn, just set that aside. And now, as I said before, I cut my guides very much so on the long side, so I'm just gonna cut off, you know, the little extra tails that I have there, just because I don't really need it to be much longer. Now that this is stretched out, I don't have to worry about them sliding through. And that's how we do one strip. Now, as I've said before, you need to have 4 of these strips. And in the next portion of this video, I'm going to show you the joining technique for this pattern. There are several different ways that you can join hairpin lace loom, but for this approach, we are going to use a braided look, and it's also quite simple. So go ahead, crochet up your remaining 3 strips, and we'll meet back up. We'll join the strips, and we'll be done. Once you have all 4 strips complete, we're ready to start joining. Now you're going to need your crochet hook, and I like to use the same hook that I use to crochet. However, it may be easier for you to use a larger crochet hook. We are going to be working with 5 loops at a time, and you might find it much easier if you use, say, like a size 9 or 10, because then all 5 loops will fit under that hook, whereas they don't on this one. It's not necessary. You can use a smaller hook. So, like I said, I'll use this hook for now. You want to set up 2 of your strips so that they're side by side. And the way that we're going to join these is from the bottom up. So as you see, I've got 2 of my strands laying side by side, and you're going to want to work on a flat surface. It even helps to unwind both strips at the same time, and that way you can kind of coordinate how the colors are going to work together if you're using a variegated yarn like I've got here. So basically, I just try to have different colors next to each other. I don't want to have basically the same color pattern, because then once you crochet it up, it's not quite as detailed. With that being said, to do this technique, we want to start working on one side, and then we're going to cross over to the other side. And then we're going to cross back over, and we're just going to zigzag all the way up. Now, one thing that's very important to remember when working with hairpin lace, when you've started this section, and let's say we've started with this strip right here, and then we've jumped over to this one, then when we add our next piece, our third piece onto this side, we have to start with this side and then cross over to the other one. Now, we'll go over that again as we start joining the third piece, but just keep that in the back of your mind, okay? It's very important, if you don't kind of stagger the way you join these, one piece is going to end up longer than the other, okay? So to get this started, all you need to do, for the sake of this tutorial, let's start with this side first and place 5 loops on your hook. Just like that, okay? You want to make sure that they're not twisted and that they are in order. So you don't want to have, you know, one on top of the other or whatnot. And once you have those 5 on your hook, go over to the other side and collect 5 loops. And once you have those 5 loops, you want to kind of keep them separated. And this is actually where the variegated yarn comes in handy. I know that I just need to pull these light green loops through the dark green loops. And what I like to do is just hold the loops open that are on the bottom and then just work the other loops right on through, just like that. Now, to get a closer view on things, since I just added stitches from this side over here, now we need to jump over to the other side, and I want to collect my next 5 stitches and just place them on the hook. And then we're going to pull these 5 through these 5. So again, just take your fingers to hold that open and then just pull them right on through. Now you want to make sure all of your loops follow along. Sometimes they'll slip off your hook, especially if you're using the smaller one. That's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing, you want to make sure that you get all of these loops, because let's say you missed one because it was like tucked underneath, then you will be able to see it. It's going to be sticking out, and then your count is going to be off at the end of the row. Okay, so now we've worked 5 on this side of the work. We're going to collect 5 on the opposite side. And you can see, even though I've got my guide, see how these are wanting to twist on me? So I'm just going to untwist them as I place them on my hook. And we are working in groups of 5. So again, put 5 loops on my hook. Okay, I've got those 5. And again, we're going to pull these 5 through these 5. So grab those bottom 5 to open them up, and then just simply pull it right on through. Now, one thing to note, we're not really working a tension or a gauge in this portion. That's why it doesn't really matter that we're using a small hook for these, this many loops at a time. We do want to try to keep things a little bit loose and somewhat consistent, because when we're done, we want this to look like a braid. However, when we're this early in the stage, if you're looking at your piece and you're thinking, wow, that's super crooked and it doesn't really look much like a braid, I promise once you add a little bit more to it, it'll start to take shape. So something that I found is easy, now the way I've got these situated on camera is so that they're vertical, but I have found that it's a little bit easier if I keep them kind of at an angle, over to the side. That way I can make sure I watch the stitches from below and make sure I'm not missing any. Because that was one thing I did when I made the first scarf, was I left out a couple of loops. Okay, I've got my next 5 loops on. I'm just going to pull it through. Okay, and it's really that simple. That's all there is to it. This part is tedious for sure, and I know some of you are probably not going to like this part. And I'll be honest, it's not my favorite part either. But this joining technique is beautiful. I think it really makes the design. So, in my opinion, I think it's worth taking the extra time to make sure you do it right. So go ahead and finish joining these 2 strips, and when we get to the very end, I'll show you how to basically bind off. We're not totally binding off because we're going to end up sewing this together to make an infinity pattern. But we need to hold, basically hold this in place so that way it doesn't come unraveled as we're working the next strips onto the scarf. Once we've reached the end of our strips, joining the first 2 together, we need to fasten off the remaining 5 loops on our hook. And the way we do that is by using the tail of the strands coordinating with these loops on our hook. Okay, so we want to take the tail end of the strip that we've got here, and we just want to hook that strand and pull it up through those 5 loops, and then keep that loop on your hook. And once you do that, we're just going to yarn over again with the strand and pull that through the loop that was on our hook. and then we basically just fastened it off right there. So we've got us a little knot there. And that's how we fasten off. It's really quite simple. And now we're ready to start joining on our third strip. When we're ready to start joining the third strip, we just want to lay the new strip next to the scarf. And if you remember back when we started joining the first two, we started on this side first. We picked up 5 loops from this side, and then we picked up 5 loops from the other side. And since we did it like that, we need to rotate and do it the other way. We need to pick up 5 loops from this side first, and then we'll pick up 5 loops from the strand. And once you get that part down, it's exactly the same as far as the joining method. We join it exactly the same as if we did the other 2. So I've got my 5 strands from the piece that we joined earlier, and now I'm picking up 5 strands from the new piece. And now again, I'm just going to put my fingers underneath these last 5, or the first 5 loops that's on our hook, and I'm just going to work the other 5 right on through and just kind of pull that taut a little bit. Now, since we've got these loops on our hook, we need to jump back over to the other side, and I'm going to pick up 5 loops from that side. And again, I'm just going to pull those 5 loops through the loops that's on the hook. And I'm just going to continue on in this zigzagging motion until we reach the top. So you do the same. Go ahead and finish joining on your third strip, just like we're doing here. And then we'll start working on the 4th strip, and we are almost done with our scarves. Okay, we've gotten ourselves to the point where we've got 3 strips attached. And now again, I have finished this row and I left the 5 loops on my hook, and I'm taking the tail from the strip next to it, and I'm just going to wrap my yarn around the hook, and I'm going to pull that loop through the 5 strands that were on my hook, and then I'm going to yarn over and I'm going to pull the tail through the loop on my hook just so I can fasten that loop off. Now we just have one more strip to add on, and then I will show you how to finish up the sides. Okay, I've lined my last strip next to the scarf, and this time we need to start out by picking up 5 loops from the new strand. So I'm just picking up 5 loops onto my hook, and now I'm going to pick up 5 loops from the scarf side. And just like before, we just need to pull the first 5 strands through the back 5 strands. So this is exactly the same as the previous 3 strips. So go ahead and attach this last strip, and then we'll talk about finishing up the sides. Alright, at this point I have joined my very last strip, and just like we've been doing, we need to secure off these last 5 loops, and to do so I'm grabbing the tail from the strip right next to it. I'm going to wrap it, pull it through the 5 loops, and then pull that tail through the loop that's on my hook. And that fastens off the side. Now, at this point, we can go ahead and remove our guides. If you did use them to help keep things secure and in one spot, we can go ahead and remove those. And you may have to pull a little bit on these, but they should come out fairly easy. So go ahead and remove your guides if you've used them, and when we come back we'll start tying up the sides. Alright, I finished removing all of my guides, and now what we need to do is finish up each side of the scarf. So pick a side to work on, grab your crochet hook. We are going to be doing pretty much the same thing on the sides as we did to join the strips together. Okay, so only difference is we're not going to be zigzagging back and forth. To start off, you need to gather up 10 loops. And separate these into 2 groups of 5. Now with them separated, you're going to pull the top 5 strands through the bottom 5 strands. Now we need to pick up 5 more loops, and then we're going to pull those new 5 strands through the 5 that are on our hook. And repeat. Pick up 5 loops and pull those 5 loops through the loop on our hook. And as you can see, that's just going to give us a nice braided edge that matches the joining technique that we used. Now go ahead and finish off this edge and the other edge using this technique. It's going to be exactly the same. And when we fasten off at the very top, we're going to do that in the same way that we did when we were joining the strips together. We're going to grab one of the tails from the neighboring strip, and we're essentially just going to fasten that off. Once you've completed these 2 steps, then we'll get to sewing our scarf together so that it's an infinity scarf, and we'll be all done. Once you get your ends braided up, you can really see the pattern emerge. Now this is basically what our scarf is going to look like when it's finished. Now before we sew this together, I want to demonstrate one thing for you. Now if you flip your scarf over to the other side and inspect your joins, then there may be a case where you dropped a stitch or a loop or just left it out completely. Now you can see here I've done that. In my joining, this loop has gotten left behind and it's now just kind of dangling. If that doesn't bother you, you can leave it like that. However, I do want to demonstrate one thing that you can do to fix this, so that way you don't have to rip back your entire scarf, and it'll save you a lot of time. So I've got this straggler loop here in the camera, and I want to show you the easiest and the best way to hide this without having to frog your work. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pair of scissors and I'm going to cut the loop so that it's in 2 pieces. Now we can't just leave it like this, because if we did, there's a chance that it could unravel. So I'm just going to tie this in a couple of knots, and that's going to secure the yarn so that it doesn't come undone. And then once I'm sure the knot is secure, I'm going to trim off the excess yarn, and you can see there it's pretty well hidden. You know, you can't really see it. Now I've had to do this in a couple of places because none of us are perfect. You know, it happens from time to time where we miss one of those loops, and that's perfectly fine because you figure out a way to make it work without having to redo the whole thing. So you can see when you flip the scarf over to the front, you can't see at all where that loop was sticking out. So now all that's left to do is to sew the scarf so that it's in an infinity pattern. And what I like to do to get this started is align the two sides, and I still have all of my tails here, and I'm going to use those tails to help start off this process. So I'm just going to take two of the tails that are right next to each other, and I'm just going to tie them in a knot. And I'll leave those tails there for now. So then I'm going to pick up my next two tails, and you want to pick the tails that are on strips that are, you know, basically right on top of each other. And then just tie that one in a knot as well. Okay, move on to the next tail. Tie this together. Okay, and then let's see, I've got my last one here. So I'm going to tie this together as well. Okay. Okay, to secure the ends together, go ahead and thread your darning needle with a scrap piece of yarn. Make sure you've got your strips aligned properly. And I'm going to start off by putting my yarn just under the first couple of strands from my side braid. And I want to pull that through about a foot or so. That should give us enough length to be able to make it across. Now essentially all we're going to do is just whip stitch across. So I've gone into the single crochet section right there, and then I'll put one more in there just to secure things. And then that brings us over to the braided section. And so I'm just going to slip the needle under a couple of strands and pull it on through. And then maybe do that one more time under a couple of strands from the braid and pull through. Now I've got myself to the next row of single crochets. That gives me something solid to work in. Put a couple of whip stitches right there. Once you've made your way to the other side, you just want to put a couple of stitches in the end here to secure things up. I'm going to place one more right on the corner, and then you just want to knot off your yarn. So I'm just putting the needle through that end to make myself a knot. Now once you've done that, all that's left to do is weave these tails through the single crochet portion. So you can do that, or if you don't care that you've got a couple little stragglers, you can just cut them right off, and essentially they won't be seen because they're going to be on the inside of the scarf anyways. If you do choose to weave in the ends, I'll go ahead and demonstrate that now. So I'm just going to pick up an end that's right next to a single crochet row, and I'm just going to work this up through the stitches with my darning needle. And that's really all there is to it. Just like if you're weaving in ends on a regular piece of crochet work. So just weave it back and forth a couple of times until you're certain that it's secure. And then just cut off your straggler. Just go ahead and fix all of your loose ends, and we'll come back and I'll show you my finished product. When you're all done, you'll have a beautiful scarf that should look something like this. Now it's quite stretchy, so you shouldn't have any problem wrapping this around 2 times around your neck, and it should make a nice, cozy, and a very warm scarf. On behalf of BHookedCrochet.com, I'm your host Brittany, and this has been a crochet along for the Hairpin Lace Infinity Scarf. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.